In the plateaus of Central Asia lay a fermenting of nomadic traditions whose people, from antiquity and beyond, played antagonists to their more civilized neighbors. The Seljuk Turks, founded by the eponymous warlord Seljuk sometime in the 10th century, came from this lineage. As they descended from modern Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan into Persia, the Seljuks amassed a large force and considerable territory, legitimizing their rule through alignment with the Sunni-led Abbasid Antidom. At first, the Seljuks existed in uneasy tension with the Byzantines. For a brief period, they made a truce with their Christian neighbors, electing to concern themselves with curbing the power of the Shia Fatimid Empire. But this truce became precarious when the Seljuks began amassing on the borders of Armenia and Georgia. By the 1060s, the Seljuks had encroached into Georgia, Armenia, and even regions of central Turkey, which were part of the Byzantine heartland. In 1067, Caesarea, the capital of Cappadocia, was sacked by the Seljuks. Caesarea was a major city and a trading hub at the time, and its sacking sent shockwaves throughout the empire. By the time the Seljuks were making their incursions westward, Romanos IV Diogenes was deployed on the western frontier in Bulgaria. He had shown his military prowess against the nomadic Pechenegs that threatened Byzantium along the Danube and was appointed Duke of a province of Bulgaria. It was then that the bloody sack of Caesarea occurred. The city was pillaged, its churches and holy shrines desecrated. Caesarea lay within Diogenes' home province of Cappadocia, and his helplessness stung the young general. The event represented the pervasive rot and decline of the eastern half of the empire, and Romanos knew something had to be done. Meanwhile, in the luxurious imperial palace of Constantinople, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine Diogenes was approaching death. Already old when he assumed the throne, Constantine's 8-year rule was marked by a gradual loss of Byzantine territory. Constantine Diogenes was the first of his family's branch to ascend to the imperial throne. The Diogenes family had been on the peripheries of Byzantine politics for some time until fortune allowed for an opening for the duchy. But Constantine X was not a military commander. He was a high-ranking court official, chosen by court counselors and other nobles because he was easily malleable. Under his reign, the deterioration of the Byzantine army, in particular the eastern components, accelerated. Constantine X was too busy engaging with court politics and philosophical debates to concern himself with the decline of his empire. When he lay on his deathbed, he summoned his wife, Eudocia. She was his second wife and nearly 30 years younger than him. She stared at his graying beard and his pale face, into his low, sickly eyes as he made a feeble last demand that she not remarry and that his sons Michael and Konstantinos be made emperors. Konstantinos, at the time, was too young to rule on his own, while Michael was seen as mentally unfit to rule. Eudocia stared loveless at the eyes of her ailing husband and in front of the Patriarch of Constantinople swore to Constantine's last request.
Upon hearing of Constantine's death, Romanos slowly and secretively assembled game support from various provinces and aristocrats in Byzantium. However, Byzantine intelligence uncovered the plot and had Romanos Diogenes arrested and brought before a trial in Constantinople. When asked to account for his crimes, the tall, broad-chested, and handsome general spoke from the heart. The accusations were true, he declared. He had conspired to install himself as emperor, and the empire was on the verge of collapse from the Seljuk threat from the east. The Byzantine aristocracy had done nothing to combat the pillaging that was occurring in the empire's heartland. A formidable response and leadership were needed to subdue the Seljuk threat. The fate of the empire was at stake. The onlookers were silent. They knew Romanos was right, and he was an ideal candidate for this task. Romanos came from military aristocracy on his father's side, and his mother was the niece of the previous Byzantine emperor Romanos Argyros. He was charismatic, mostly unconcerned with the court politics that had neglected Greater Byzantium, and without a doubt, he had blue blood in his veins. Amongst the attendants of the trial was the Empress Regent Eudocia. Recently a widow, the death of her husband spurred a power vacuum. Her son, Michael Ducas, although of age, was mentally incompetent. She had ambitions herself, and feared the influence of her widow's family, the Ducai. She knew that her position in power would grow tenuous under the poor rule of Michael. Many of the Ducai were in attendance during this trial, most notably Caesar John Ducas. Caesar John had been given the courtly title of Caesar by his brother, the deceased Constantine X, to denote his political importance. Caesar John felt immense contempt for Romanos, who threatened his political influence. Would it be blinding, execution, or a tonsured humiliation and confinement to a monastery? Those were the sentences that Caesar John and the Ducai hoped for. But the charisma and sincerity that Romanos emitted throughout the Roman Senate house proved to surround him in an exalted halo. Romanos' trial became the talk of Constantinople, and he was summoned to the great palace of Constantinople, where along the illustrious halls of the throne room, he met with the Empress Eudocia. Illustrious and ornate atop her throne, she stared down at Romanos and was moved to tears by his selflessness. Romanos was granted a pardon, which only propelled him into more fame. Shortly after, Eudocia further leveraged her position and asked Romanos to become her husband and emperor. How quickly fortunes change.
Romanos' accession was met with significant opposition from factions allied with the Ducas. However, much of the other members of the court consented to it. While Eudocia had sworn to her ailing husband never to remarry in front of the Bishop of Constantinople, Eudocia had this agreement annulled. Romanos spent no time lavishing in the decadent splendor of Constantinople. Immediately, Romanos engaged in a campaign against the Seljuks of the East. While the Western army had been a focus of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern army had become undermined due to various policies of previous emperors. Romanos revitalized this, installing trusted members of his army to train and levy recruits from the eastern provinces. His campaigns against the Seljuk Turks were a moderate success, although he could not land a decisive blow on the Seljuks. Their hit-and-run battle tactics made them slippery enemies. He had pushed them further east from the heartland in Syria, but sporadic raiding parties still ravaged bordering provinces. Eventually, a peace agreement was made between the Seljuks and the Byzantines. During this time, Romanos concerned himself with internal affairs and banished the subversive Caesar John Ducas to his estates in northern Turkey, away from the politics of Constantinople. The Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan himself was more concerned with the Fatimid Empire and his own internal Turkmen rebellions. But that peace slowly deteriorated as Turkmen eventually began to raid along the borders. All the while, Romanos began to help seditious Seljuk leaders, attempting to undermine Alp Arslan. In 1070, Alp Arslan entered Byzantine Armenia and took control of the city of Manzikert. Mustering all the troops he could, Romanos marched through the Byzantine heartland. He would meet Alp Arslan and attempt to end this once and for all. On August 26, 1071, the rumble of kettle drums pulsates through the arid Armenian highlands as troops march into formation. Shrill trumpets called nafir cut high through the rumbling as Alp Arslan, garbed in white funeral robes, surveys his army. He was prepared to die in battle, and his troops absorbed his courage. Meeting the Turks was the Byzantine army. The army had been divided into four main units: right and left flanks, a center, and a rear guard. The center was where most of the troops resided and was commanded by Romanos, composed mostly of elite Cappadocian soldiers, while the right flank was commanded by an ardent supporter of Romanos. The left flank was composed mostly of the Western army, which had been supportive of Romanos, commanded by Nicephorus Bryennius. However, it was the rear guard that proved to be a locus of treachery. Commanding the rear guard was Andronicus Ducas, the son of the recently exiled Caesar John Ducas. Why Romanos had given Andronicus the rearguard remains unknown, but it can only be assumed that he sought to placate the Ducai. Politically, he may have thought that this would unite the families against their common enemy. This proved to be a fatal mistake. The Byzantines had surged forward at a rapid rate as most of the Seljuk fighters retreated and harassed the Byzantines with arrows. The Byzantines eventually managed to capture the Seljuk camp, but nightfall loomed. While the Byzantines had attained significant ground, Romanos had not yet succeeded in engaging with the Seljuks in a pitched battle. It was then, as nightfall loomed, that Romanos ordered a retreat to the Byzantine camp. This order was done by reversing the imperial battle standard. However, this signal proved to be an opportunity for confusion and treachery. Andronicus and his unscathed rearguard interpreted the signal as a signal to flee. Perhaps Romanos had fallen, so he and the rearguard abandoned the battle, rather than cover for the retreating army as a rearguard ought to during a retreat. The right army unit was routed, and the left unit held for some time before fleeing in disarray. Romanos' main unit was surrounded. Romanos and his men fought the surrounding Turkmen bravely, but they were overwhelmed. Romanos' horse was slain, and he continued to fight till he could no longer hold his sword. Surrounded by Turkmen, Romanos was captured by a lowly Turkish soldier, an anecdote that has lived on in Islamic and Turkish legend. Romanos became the second Roman emperor to become captured in battle, a feat previously held by Valerian for over 800 years before. Most of what was left of the Byzantine army fled west towards Constantinople, while some dispersed to other regions of the empire. Exhausted, bloodied, and in tattered varbs, Romanos was presented to Alp Arslan. The Sultan did not initially believe it was the emperor, ordering the other captured Byzantine officials to verify his identity. Arslan then proceeded to symbolically humiliate Romanos by having the emperor lay his neck under the Sultan's feet. Yet, after this humiliation, Arslan treated the emperor with extreme respect and dignity. When Arslan asked Romanos what he would have done if the roles were reversed, Romanos replied, "I would have killed you cruelly." Arslan admired the emperor's candid response, and an agreement was made that involved a hefty ransom of nomisma, which was Byzantine currency, which included annual installments, concessions of Byzantine land, as well as a potential marriage alliance between Arslan's son and Romanos' future prospective daughter. Romanos was released from captivity swiftly, but his position as emperor was in shambles. When word reached the capital that Romanos had fallen at Manzikert, a brutal coup was enacted by the Ducai. Michael Ducas was proclaimed emperor, Eudocia was confined to a nunnery, and when word became known that Romanos was still alive, a civil war ensued between those allied with Romanos and the Ducai. While Romanos was still able to muster support, it became clear that momentum was on the side of the Ducai. Still recovering from the grueling Battle of Manzikert, after months of civil war, he was defeated and captured by Andronicus Ducas, the young general whom he had so fatally trusted. Romanos surrendered himself under the condition that he stepped down as emperor and retired to a monastery. The surrender was brokered by 3 bishops, under the terms that Romanos was to lay his arms and abandon the purple for life in a monastery, never to assume political positions again. He was escorted into Constantinople on a donkey, dressed as a monk and with a tonsured head. The great Byzantine lion was now degraded. But Romanos' conditions of surrender were not to be honored. Caesar John, now the de facto ruler, had other ideas. He ordered Romanos be blinded. Romanos panicked and desperately pleaded to the bishops, but little could be done, and in the brutal Byzantine fashion, his eyes were gouged out with pegs. He was immediately transported to a monastery, but it would only take 3 days till Romanos Diogenes died. What tears streamed down his cheeks were overwhelmed by the blood. Upon learning about Romanos' brutal blinding, Arslan's peace treaty, which he had staunchly upheld, disintegrated, and he ordered his Turkmen to resume their raiding. A few months after the death of Romanos, Alp Arslan was stabbed by a rebellious governor in Turkestan. This only increased the chaos in Anatolia, and the region was carved up by various Turkish warlords. Anatolia was overrun, and most of Syria and Jerusalem, which had been controlled by the Fatimid Empire, were seized by the Sunni-led Seljuks. The Fatimids were, on the whole, far more permissive of Christian pilgrims, as they used pilgrims as a way to collect taxes. They even allowed for the reconstruction of Christian churches with the financial aid of Christians. The Seljuks, on the other hand, were far more hostile to Christian pilgrims. They had not maintained the intricate and financial bureaucracy of the Fatimids. Tales of this hostility towards Christian pilgrims propagated throughout Europe, the most famous of which was spread by Peter the Hermit, a mystic whose ardent preaching would become instrumental to the Crusades. Meanwhile, Michael VII Duca's ineffective rule in Byzantium was plagued by continuous revolts, and soon, much of Anatolia was under Turkish sway. While the Ducai were still influential in Byzantine politics, they were succeeded by Alexios Komnenos, who inherited a fractured empire. He appealed to the West, and many armed pilgrims who sought to travel to Jerusalem sporadically aided him against the Seljuk influence throughout Byzantium and the Holy Land. It was then, on November 1095, after years of appeals, that Pope Urban II called for a reclamation of the Holy Land during the Council of Clermont. This seemingly united the Christian world in liberating the Holy Land, beginning the series of conflicts known as the Crusades, whose influence still resides in modern consciousness.